thank you so much for this introduction and the invitation. I'm going to talk today about MDMA and emotional processing, but more in specific about the study we have planned. It's a multi-center trial, phase 2 study, sponsored by MAPS. But first of all, I'm going to give you some kind of definitions and a background. So what are emotions? We start off with the broad category of affect, and that are feelings that people experience. And then you have two things. You have emotions and mood, and we study both. So emotions are more short-lived, intense. It's when you have a fight with your partner, you disagree, you feel perhaps a bit of anger, and it can be short-lived, hopefully. But then you have mood, and it's a more persisting state. And the cause is more difficult to identify. We know that from our research that MDMA has an effect on both emotions and mood. And what is also important for my talk is that if we ask people about their emotions or their mood, it can be from their perspective, what do I feel? But we also ask them to think about what the other person feels. So that is what he or she feels. So what did we find with our studies, and what did other labs find when studying the acute effects of MDMA is that, well, I will first start off with emotion recognition. So what do? We present people with pictures of faces of people depicting an emotion that can be positive, that can be negative. And here you have an example. Usually we use color pictures, but this is just a random example. And what you see here is that you can have emotions in different intensities. This is happy with the full intensity and the low intensity. And when people received MDMA, they needed a higher intensity of the emotion anger to recognize it compared to other emotions. And I will explain later on why this is important. Also, when they were presented with fear of anger, they were not able to accurately say this is fear of or anger. They had less correct. And also when researchers looked at the frowns, they had less frowns when they saw positive emotions. So you have a more positive response to happy expressions. So what does that mean? It means that if you take MDMA, negative emotions in others are more difficult to recognize or detect, and positive emotions are responded in a more positive way. Labs have also looked into social interaction, and an example is that they asked people, tell us about a person you love or tell us a memory. And what we see is when you ingest MDMA, you use more positive words, positive emotional words to describe a situation or a person. And also the perception of empathy in the person you interact with is higher. And this is also, the last study is also an interesting one from Anthony. He used the trust game. We used it too. We did not find the same effects, but he looked into it more in depth. He did kind of a trust game. It's where people have to give money to each other, and you have to build a trust relationship, and sometimes they do not pay your trust back. And he showed that if you took MDMA, it does not make you gullible. If people betray you, you will not be nice to them. But you will be nice to them. If you've built some kind of trust, your relationship will be rebuilt quicker. So if the person responded to your trust in a good way, not betraying you all the time, then if this person betrays you once, you rebuild the relationship faster. So that is very good. So in a social interaction, partners are seen more as more caring, and your relationship is more solid. We'll come to that later on. Back to that. We also studied empathy. So from the perspective here, what do I feel? And if you show them emotions from people in stress or in and happy position. They feel more for the other person, and they are also more aroused by that situation. And this one, I've put it in bold, because actually it's one of my studies that is one of my most favorite studies. I was thinking, we always use these visual, so this kind of stimuli. But when you interact with people, it's more than seeing, it's also hearing. So I made a paradigm where I presented negative and positive sounds to people. And I showed that if you give MDMA to people, they do not experience these negative sounds as negative as when they receive placebo. So this might be very interesting in the whole mechanism of treating trauma. Also, if you look into emotional memory, you see that they have more positive memories of positive autobiographical memories and less negative ratings of negative events. So what we see is that they experience more empathy, are less disturbed by external and internal disturbing events. We also looked into mood, and then we always use, in other labs too, the profile of mood states. It contains 72 items asking about their mood. And we showed that, and other people too, that MDMA enhances positive effects. Sure, you need always science to prove that. We have enough anecdotal feedback. But we also showed that, and that is also important to just say it, that it increases negative effects. So it causes confusion, it causes anxiety. But we also know that if you have social support when you take MDMA, you can dampen the anxiety. And we also know that it decreases fatigue. So the conclusion is MDMA amplifies your mood state in total, so positive and negative mood. So if we look at this as a summary in between, if we look at what they say when they are seeing emotions in others, we know that negative emotions are more difficult to detect and positive emotions are responded in a more positive way. And we also know that social interaction is better. Other people are seen as more caring and the relationship is more solid. When you ask them about how they feel more empathy, less disturbed by negative events, and the mood state is amplified. But all of this, what I told you, is data that is collected in healthy individuals, so not suffering from psychiatric diagnosis. They are excluded from these studies. It were all placebo-controlled studies within subject studies. So what does that mean? Is that everybody received MDMA and placebo on separate conditions, so they were always their own control. It are acute effects, so not long-term effects. And they all received a single dose, and that single dose was between 75 milligrams and 125 milligrams when they received a fixed dose. Some labs choose to use a fixed dose, as we do. Other labs choose to do weight-adjusted dosing, and then they use between 35 and 105 milligrams per kilogram. But what I always say is, Rick asked what is the ideal dose? We don't know. If we already see that 75 milligrams enhances empathy and all these things I said in healthy individuals, 75 milligrams is a good dose to start off with. We also know that when you give around 150 milligrams, people are not able anymore to perform on cognitive tasks. So we do not use these higher doses because of that reason, because we want to be able to study cognition. So Ben already explained it wonderfully. So what are the brain structures that are involved in emotions? And as you see here, I used a very simplified model of emotional processing because all these areas I removed are involved in emotional processing. What is important for my talk here is the frontal cortex, and more specifically the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. And Ben showed it as the amygdala as a really big dot because he wanted to make a statement that it's hyperactive, but it's actually a very, very small structure. And indeed, it assigns value to what you experience. So you have an interaction, you have a feeling, and this emotion is pasted to the event. It goes to the hippocampus, where the memory is stored, and then the frontal cortex has is the controller in all these events. It can inhibit the amygdala activation, and it can increase the amygdala activation. So how does MDMA work? There has been some work in healthy volunteers, but not a lot of imaging studies have been done. I'm not going to talk about the first study that has been done. It has to be acknowledged that they were the first. It was done by Gamma et al., but they have done PET studies. I'm going to talk about functional MRI. So I have to make the distinction between you have task-based studies and you have resting state studies. Whenever you see a task-based study, they are being shown emotions or they have to do a task. So what do we see is when people get MDMA, their amygdala response to fearful, threatful emotions is decreased. If we look into the resting state studies, we see that the connectivity, so the communication between the hippocampus, your memory, and your controller is decreased. We also know that it increases the communication between your memory and your emotional seat. And these are also two I'm not going to go into detail. Like Ben said, it also has effects on the hormonal level. We showed it, that it increases your oxytocin levels. We were not able to show the connection with our empathy levels. But you can argue that it's because oxytocin has to do with bonding, it plays a role in this. Also with cortisol levels, they increase. You can argue that it has to be something to do with anxiety, but we were not able to causally link it. So, coming to the main point of my presentation, seeing these effects, MDMA might help in the treatment of PTSD. Wow. Why? Because, and I just put in there, I'm not a PTSD expert, but I just put in some examples why MDMA might work. Because PTSD patients experience emotional numbing. They have difficulty in opening up and talking about their trauma. And we know from scientific research that they have a hyperactive amygdala and a hypoactive prefrontal cortex. And we also know that MDMA has the opposite effect. I really like this paper by Johansen and Krebs. It was published in 2009, and it contains 3 hypotheses why MDMA could work in PTSD. Here you have, I'm going to explain this, but here you also have a nice publication by Emerson in the MAPS Bulletin, and it contains a more an overview why MDMA could work in the treatment of PTSD. But back to the hypothesis. So Johansen said there are 3 things why MDMA could work. Is because MDMA increases oxytocin levels. Yes, we showed that, and another group in the Netherlands showed that too, and now a group in Chicago showed it too. And that might strengthen the therapeutic alliance. Wardle has shown that it increases sociability, so check. MDMA increases the prefrontal activity, check, that was already shown. Amygdala decreases activity, check. And then you also have these effects on hormones. That has all been proven. And here, this is also a very interesting recent paper in animals that shows something about fear conditioning. But this was all work done in healthy volunteers or animals. And our visionary, Rick Doblin, this was not new information. like our visionary, Rick, he's somewhere here. He already published this in 2002, stating why MDMA could work. And really, if you do not know the paper, read it. It's really funny, because basically what he states is in what we have shown. So we know now that MDMA works for PTSD, based on the studies that have been done in the States. But we still have a knowledge gap, and that is what I'm interested in the most, is what is the underlying neurobiology? Sure, you can see this treatment effect, but you want to know what happens in the brain. Does MDMA really reset it? Changes the activation? It must be. So everything I showed you, like I said, is based on work with healthy volunteers. So we do not know what happens in the brains of patients. So that is what we want to do in our multi-center study. I have to say, ethics approval is pending, so we cannot start yet, but I hope that it can start soon. So what are we going to do? We're with, actually this is old information. I heard yesterday that we're now with 7 European centers. The target is we're going to do a phase 2 open label trial, just like all the centers in the States did. But with a couple of these European centers, 2 in the Netherlands, 1 in the UK, and 1 in Prague, we're going to do a sub-study, an imaging study. And what are we going to do? Here you see the schedule, the schedule of testing. We're going to do 2 experimental sessions where the PTSD patient receives MDMA. And then we're going to do, before they receive MDMA, we're going to do a scan, a functional and a structural scan. And then at the end of their treatment, we're going to scan their brains again. So that will be approximately 2 weeks after MDMA. Oh yeah, sorry, Rick, I took this picture from your excellent TED Talk. If you haven't seen it, please have a look at it. So what are we going to do? We're going to do functional imaging. We're going to do resting state. We're going to do task-based activity imaging. We're going to do magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And we're going to do a structural imaging scan. But I'm going to explain this in detail. What is resting state? Ooh, I have to speed up. So basically, it's just putting the subject in the scanner and just asking them to relax with eyes wide open, and then their brain is being scanned for 10 minutes. What do we know? I've just put this information for your information on this slide, but what is interesting to know is that in PTSD patients, so not when they got MDMA, but in PTSD patients, the resting state connectivity between the amygdala and the hippocampus is decreased. So 2 parts in your emotional system, emotional processing system. We also know that MDMA has the opposite effect. So what are we going to do, or what do we expect? We expect that bolt activity in those 2 regions is decreased. And we also expect that it has positive correlations with the brain change. The brain changes positively correlate with the subjective intensity of the experience, also based on previous work. Task-based activity, what do we know? Again, here I've put in red what is important for you. So people with PTSD have an hyperactive amygdala, and we know that MDMA in healthy volunteers causes a decrease of amygdala activation. What are we going to do? We're going to do 2 things. We're going to present PTSD patients with trauma-unrelated emotional stimuli, and we're going to present them with trauma-related stimuli. So they will be shown emotions, threat-related emotions. They will receive a block of this. They will have to, this will be the cue, and then they will be presented with 2 emotions afterwards, and then they have to say which emotion was it that you saw. And then this is the control task against, we're going to compare these 2. so that we know whether their reaction towards threatful phases has changed. What is this? This is something what is typically being done in PTSD patients. You ask the patients to describe their trauma. Then you make a small story of it, so based on their information, 2 minutes. And when they are in the scanner, you read it to them. And you ask them to relive their trauma as detailed as possible. So it has been used previously, but it will be, I think but that is also what patients do when they are in therapy, talk about their trauma. So it will, in that sense, it will be the same. What are we going to investigate? Whether the amygdala decreases in activation after MDMA has been given, so after the therapy, and whether the ventromedial prefrontal cortex the activity is increased. So whether the prefrontal cortex is in charge again after MDMA therapy. We hope that it will be less emotionally overwhelming and more tolerable to imagine their negative events. So this is actually, I think, it is all novel, but this is very exciting because the functional imaging I showed you is based on bolt activity. So it's an indirect measure of activity. You just measure how oxygenated your blood is during the task performance. MRS is something different. With this method, you can assess your neurotransmitters when imaging it. What are we going to do? We're going to do, so we're going to look into NAA, that is a neuronal marker of clinical integrity, and we're going to assess glutamate. So we know that both are involved in PTSD they are disturbed in PTSD. So no work actually has been done in MDMA in acute studies. No MRS studies have been done. But what we know is that after repeated ecstasy use, there is no change. And then we're talking about ecstasy use and not MDMA use. There has been animal studies done, and we know that in PTSD models of animal models, glutamate is decreased in the prefrontal cortex, and MDMA increases these levels. So basically, what do we expect? We expect that it changes in PTSD patients. So this is actually it will be challenging because we will have a number of centers. We will have to combine data from different scanners. Some centers will use the same scanner, but then still, it will be challenging to combine, but interesting. What is interesting for me is that we will also do an anatomical scan. So, and there is animal research that shows that MDMA is neurotoxic. But we also know that MDMA, that they gave that to animals in a way that you would not use it as a person. They gave it intravenously 2 times a day for 4 days in a row. And then it was neurotoxic. So we also know that MDMA, after a single dose, does not induce functional impairment in memory in people. So it will be interesting to look into that, whether we are able to show anatomical differences. What are points of attention is that, I'm not going into that, but that it will be very interesting because we will have males, females. We know that there are differences in these effects in healthy volunteers. We will use different doses in patients because, as you know, a person will receive during an experimental session 1 dose. And after 2 hours, he or she will be asked, do you want a supplementary dose? And the therapist can give the supplementary dose or not. So not everybody is going to receive the exact same dose. So it will be interesting to include that in the statistical analysis. And we also know that you give MDMA together with your therapy. So what is the effect of the MDMA? What is the effect of the therapy? But I think that when we have our data set, it will be interesting to compare it with existing data sets who have just done therapy or who have done an intervention with medicines. So, like I said, what are we going to do? A multi-center study when we have ethics approval. Why is this relevant? I think this is very relevant because we have to give a neurobiological face to the effects that are already being shown and to be even more convincing towards society that it works and explain why it works. So I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like to thank Breaking Convention for putting all of us together so that we can interact and learn from each other. I would like to thank MAPS for making this possible and really their dedication and perseverance. And it's great that Rick keeps on putting effort in this and the whole team. I also would like to thank my team because if you don't have a team, there is no research. I would like to thank everybody who is involved, and you can always contact me, and I'm now here for questions.